Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another episode of Your Bible Questions Answered. Today is Saturday. It's the 24th day of February, 2024, and we're continuing to answer the question, what did Jesus mean by the parable of the fig tree that he gave in Matthew chapter 24, verses 32 to 35, and it's also recorded in Mark's Gospel as well as Luke's Gospel. And we saw last time there are three major mistakes that are often made in interpreting this parable. First, it's a mistake to equate the fig tree with the nation Israel because the Bible never equates the two. Second, it is a mistake to see the budding of the fig tree refer to Israel returning to its ancient homeland in the last days. And the third mistake is taking the phrase, this generation shall not pass, so all these things be fulfilled, as the generation that sees Israel return to its ancient homeland, where the clock starts showing a time of the end is very, very soon. In other words, it's a soon indication that Christ is returning. We saw that all three of these do not work. And we said there's five major problems in attempting to say that they do. Last time we talked about the first problem, and that is Israel is never, ever in the Bible equated with the analogy of the fig tree. The fig tree never represents the nation of Israel in either the Old or the New Testament. And the second major problem was simply that Jesus said, when you see all these things fulfilled, then you know the end is near. That's when the fig tree starts to bud, when you see all these things. Well, one of the signs that he mentioned, the abomination that causes desolation, that doesn't occur till 3.5 years into the last 7 year period. And so that is the sign he was referring to. That's the sign of the time of the end, not the sign of Israel coming back to its ancient homeland, because soon thereafter, of course, 3.5 years after that takes place, we know Christ will return again the second time. So those are two major problems, two insurmountable problems. Well, there's three more. We're going to finish that off today. Our third problem is there's nothing in the Gospel of Matthew that predicts Israel's return to its homeland in the last days. And this is a huge problem. In the context of Matthew 24 to 25, nothing is said about Israel's removal from their homeland and then coming back in the last days. No prediction of this whatsoever. And so Jesus' illustration of the budding of the fig tree would make no sense whatsoever in the context of Matthew, since nothing is said about them being removed, being in exile, and then coming back at the time of the end. So context, 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 it just doesn't fit. Number four, the fourth problem is, if Israel is the fig tree, then who are the other trees? What it's referring to? Is it referring to? In Luke's gospel, we read this. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the other trees. When they sprout leaves, you see for yourselves and know that summer is now near. That's Luke 21, 29 to 30. Well, in Luke's gospel, it's just not one tree in view, the fig tree, it's many other trees. So what is that referring to? Well, the point is, it's literally an illustration from nature. Like the fig trees, there are other trees in the Holy Land that are not evergreen, they're deciduous, and they lose their leaves in the wintertime. And in spring, the leaves start to come back. And when the sprouts come back, you know that summer is near. And the analogy he's giving, when you see the fig tree and these other trees, you know that summer is near. Therefore, when you see all these things that I'm referring to, these 11 signs, including the abomination of desolation, then you know the end is near. But you have to see all the signs before you will know the end is near. So basically, since this is an illustration from nature, it has nothing to do with Israel becoming a modern state in 1948 or the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967. It's not referring to that. Those are huge signs. It's referring to the signs of the last 7 year period, particularly the abomination that causes desolation. That is the sign that the end is near. Now, also, we've gone into greater detail in explaining this particular point in Appendix 3 of our book, 45 Common Mistakes in Last Days Bible Prophecy Cleared Up, from our website, Educating Our World, under the subject of Bible prophecy. It's a free download. Again, numbers 16 through 18, the mistakes. Appendix 3 in the book, we call this the use of all the trees, how it's used in the parable of the fig tree in Luke 21, 29. The use of this phrase has no symbolic meaning. And we go through Luke's gospel and we show that this phrase here, it's very clearly an analogy from nature. It fits very well with that. So we encourage you to look at that also. There's a lot of more evidence besides what we're just saying here. That's part of it. In fact, we have, as we're going to say, 3 appendices that go into further detail. All right, so that's problem number 4, all the trees. The fig tree and all the trees. Just an analogy from nature. Finally, number 5, the fifth problem is the length of a biblical generation in the New Testament's about 40 years, and only 40 years at the outset. How do we know this? We'll give you 4 examples. Number 1, a generation is defined as 40 years in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. It says this, "There your fathers tested me and tried me, and they saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I became provoked at that generation and said, their hearts are always wandering, and they have not known my ways." Hebrews 3, 8 and 9. Now note that the generation is specifically defined as being 40 years at the time of Christ. A second example, Job lived to the 4th generation, or 140 years. We're told this in Job 42:16, that after this, after his tragedies that went on in his life, he lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations. So Job lived 140 years after the tragic events in his life. He lived to see his children and their children to the 4th generation. So if we divide 140 years by 4, we find that a generation is about 35 years in length. Again, not a very long period of time. Example number 3. There were 14 generations from the Babylonian captivity until the time of Christ. The same writer who wrote about the parable of the fig tree tells us in Matthew 1:17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. That's Matthew 1:17. Now he stated there are 14 generations from the people being deported to Babylon until the time of Jesus. Well, if we calculate this, the last deportation was in 587 BC, and we calculate that the number of years to the time of Christ and divide it by 14, we come up with a generation being about 41 years. Again, approximately the same amount of time. Illustration 3. Illustration 4, or example 4, the definition of the word generation from a Greek dictionary. Here's what it says. The whole multitude of men living at the same time and age, the time ordinarily occupied by each successive generation, a space of 30 to 33 years. That's Olive Tree's Enhanced Strong's Dictionary. So this is another indication that a biblical generation was a short period of time, anywhere from 30 to 40 years, no longer. Now, as we have noted, at the time of Jesus, it was approximately 40 years. Why is this important? Well, because if we use what it meant at the time of Jesus, then we see that the length of a biblical generation would contradict any attempt to use the rebirth of the modern state of Israel in 1948, or when Jerusalem was reunified in 1967 as a starting point, because 40 years from 1948 is 1988. Christ didn't come back then. 40 years from 1967 is 2007. Jesus didn't return then, so that doesn't work. So neither are possible starting points. Now, we want to make this next point very clear. The logical result of making this claim. Therefore, for anyone claiming that Jesus' employment of the fig tree is representative of Israel and its budding is a prediction of the return of the nation in the last days, or even perhaps the reunification of Jerusalem, and then his return will occur before the generation that sees the fig tree budding passes away, is faced with a huge problem. Why? Because a biblical generation is 40 years. At the time of Jesus, it was 40 years. Because of this interpretation will not work. In fact, what it does is make Jesus giving a false prediction. Now, what Jesus said in the parable of the fig tree, let's pay close attention to this. He says, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Matthew 24, 34 to 35. Well, if he's talking about a 40-year generation from the time Israel becomes a modern state, then this did not come to pass. Again, let's pay close attention to what Jesus said. First, he prefaced his statement by the solemn words, I tell you the truth. This indicates he's about to say something of monumental importance. He then goes on to say that his words have an everlasting meaning. In other words, in the strongest of terms, he's guaranteeing the truth about the parable of the fig tree. Yet, if one makes this illustration refer to Israel and refers to their last days coming to the promised land and forming a modern state, then it makes Jesus a liar. because 40 years from 1948 to 1988, and he did not return. Even if you take the reunification of Jerusalem, 40 years from that's 2007, and he didn't return in 2007. So his claim would not be true. So whether you realize it or not, if you're making such a claim like this, in essence, you're making Jesus out to be a liar. And hopefully this will begin to sink into those who continue to make such claims that a generation's 40 years from the time a certain event happens, Jesus must return. That's not what he's referring to. So what is the answer? Well, it's real simple. The fig tree is an analogy from nature. Accordingly, if it's not a parable, it's not a symbol, the parable is not a symbol of Israel, and the budding of the leaves is not speaking of them returning to their ancient homeland in the last days, and the precise number of years in a generation is 40 years at its longest, what in the world does it mean? Well, again, we're going to simply put its analogy from nature. Unlike most trees in the Holy Land, fig trees lose their leaves in winter. When a fig tree begins to bud in the spring, there's other trees that do the same thing, and they put forth its leaves. It indicates that summer is near. So when you see all these signs occur in the same manner, the nearness of the Lord's return is at hand. Indeed, the generation that sees all of these signs will see his return. It's real simple. As the fig tree buds, then you know summer is near. When you see all these signs, you know the end is near. And again, all these signs include the abomination of desolation, which takes place 3.5 years before the return of Christ. So in the same manner and in the same way, the Greek word vakutos is used in Matthew 24:33 that indicates that. So in the same way, in the same manner, as you see the fig tree bud, and you know summer's coming, in the same manner, when you see all of these signs, the 11 signs that he mentioned, then you know the end is near. Therefore, the budding of the fig tree represents the culmination of the 11 signs that Jesus indicates in Matthew 24:4-15. When all of them occur, then the world will know that his coming is at hand. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, and to sum up, Jesus' parable, the fig tree does not represent Israel. It has nothing to do with the people of Israel returning to their ancient homeland in the last days. Neither is it meant for believers to attempt to calculate the time of Christ's return, either for his church, the rapture, or his second coming. And this mistake has been made over and over again, where people use the one generation, the 40-year generation, which was correct, and said, well, it's in 1948, 40 years, 1988, Christ must come back in 1988. And then 7 years earlier, the rapture of the church will take place. That's going to happen in 1981. Believe me, I was around in 1981 when that was a popular view and people were expecting that was it. Well, it didn't happen that way because that's not the right interpretation of the parable of the fig tree. So it is a mistake to claim that Jesus' word in this context means any of these things that we mentioned. They are mistakes. Let's not make these mistakes. And again, for further detail, we have 3 appendices in our book. Fig trees in the Bible, Appendix 1, where we look at every illustration of the fig tree or figs in the Bible and show that none of them refer to the nation of Israel. Appendix 2, a look at the various ways the phrase this generation in the parable of the fig tree has been interpreted. That's a rather fascinating study, by the way. And then number 3, the use of all the trees in the parable of the fig tree in Luke 21:29 shows that it has no symbolic meaning. It's just simply speaking of literal trees that shed their leaves and they begin to come back in the spring, saying summer is near. And in the same way, when these events begin to take place, you know that the coming of the Lord is indeed near. All right, hopefully that's helped. Again, there's a ton of material we have on our website in this. We want you to download it, read it, look at it. We have a lot more than what we've even said here. So please think about this and, consider the facts as the Bible puts them. All right. Well, thanks for watching. I'm Don Stewart. Until next time, may the Lord richly, richly bless.